We've just come to the end of testing our trail bike of the year for 2018, and the Canyon Spectral CF 9.0 was one of the top contenders. The bike was launched late last year, and it's clear that Canyon spent a lot of time developing this new frame. In fact, it's probably one of the tidiest frames in the entire test this year. This is shown by some of the little details that Canyon have engineered into the frame. For example, the down tube protector doubles as a cable guide, so you're not having to thread outer cables through the frame. This makes working on the bike a lot easier. It's quite clearly a totally different bike to the Spectral that won Trail Bike of the Year last year. The frame has been re-engineered, and this includes a new kinematic for the suspension, and it is actually an improvement despite loving last year's bike. Canyon's engineers have done this to alter the kinematic of the suspension. This is to improve performance both when you're pedalling and when you're braking, so they say. But we'll talk about the performance later on. As you'd come to expect from Canyon, the value is pretty good, although it's maybe not as good as it used to be. The Spectral range of bikes comes with one 40mm of travel at the back, and they're mated with one 50mm forks, and that's either a 35mm chassis RockShox fork or a 34mm chassis Fox fork. Obviously, Canyon are offering both carbon fibre and alloy versions of the Spectral. There's also a women's Spectral which has women's specific geometry and a slightly different kinematic for the suspension as well. For Trail Bike of the Year this year, Canyon sent us the CF 9.0, so that's got a carbon fibre frame and a mid-level spec. That comes in at £3,200, or in Europe you'd be paying €3,499. The US don't get the full Canyon range, but they do the CF 9.0 Pro, which comes with a slightly different spec, namely the wheels and tyres, and that comes in at $4,499. For that money you get Fox Performance Elite fork and shock. You also get a Shimano XT 11-speed drivetrain with the 11-46 cassette, and then you get DT Swiss XM 1501 wheels and a pair of Maxxis tyres. All the Spectrals come with 2.6-inch rubber mated to 30mm internal width rims, other than the CF 9.0 Pro spec, which comes with Mavic wheels and a 2.4-inch Mavic tyre. Personally, I'm not entirely sold on the 2.6-inch size. For a bike like the Spectral, I'd actually rather see a 2.4 or a 2.5-inch wide trail tyre, which I think offers as much grip as you really need, but slightly more precise and give a slightly more accurate feel to the bike. When you're jumping between different bikes and you jump on this 2.6, it doesn't feel quite as composed or quite as accurate when you're going through real tight nadry stuff as a slightly narrower tyre does, and I prefer that accuracy. If you do like the 2.6-inch format, Canyon have done a reasonable job of speccing the tyres. Up front there's a Maxxis Minion DHF, and this is a really good tyre. There's a good shoulder tread on there for a good aggressive cornering. At the back there's a Recon, and I'm not entirely sold on that, especially if you're riding in wetter, muddier conditions. It's got a slightly lower profile tread, doesn't offer quite as much grip, both for when you're climbing up stuff and when you're braking heavily on descents. I'd probably match the back to the front and stick a Minion on there as well, although obviously there's an increase in drag, so it wouldn't feel quite as sprightly perhaps going up hills. The bike itself is controlled with a pair of Shimano XT brakes. You then get race face effect cockpit, so a 760 bar and a 50mm stem. There's a reverb drop post on there, 150mm for the size large that I tested, and an ergon saddle, which I got on with pretty well. Canyon have created a really balanced trail bike with the Spectral, both in terms of its geometry and its suspension performance. The front end of the bike is relatively average with a 460mm reach, and that's mated to a 430mm chainstay at the back, so your weight is pretty central in the bike. Okay, it's not super progressive in terms of its length or its slackness or anything like that, but it's a well-rounded shaped trail bike. A number of people have commented on how the bike is a chunk heavier than it was last year, and that's a fair criticism in some ways. However, Canyon say that the reason behind this is that they've upped the strength of the frame, and the Spectral has jumped up a category this year, so it is fully rated for enduro racing. And in fact, Joe Barnes, one of the dudes of Hazard who races on their EWS team, will be racing the Spectral at some of the rounds this year. So despite its trail orientation, it is still a bike that is perfectly capable on bigger, steeper, more technical terrain. As seems to be the holy grail with suspension kinematics, Canyon believe that they've gone for a system that is very supple at the start of its stroke, nice and progressive in the mid-stroke so you can pump it through the corners, and then does have a fair amount of progressivity towards the end of the stroke for those bigger hits and keeping the bike in control. And it's a fair assessment of how the suspension works. On slightly bumpy, ripply terrain, yeah, the bike works really nicely here. The suspension is open and active. It isolates you from these little lumps in the ground. In the mid-stroke, there is plenty of support there. It doesn't wallow through berms. You can pump it through more rolling terrain. It's got plenty of pop if you do want to hop it over rocks and roots. So it's a fun feeling, really energetically riding trail bike. If you do go into those bigger drops, or if you do slam it into rocks, the progression is relatively steep, I think, at the end of its travel. Some people find that maybe their feet are starting to get a little bit blown off the pedals, but I think this is fair. It's only a 140mm bike, so you have to have that control towards the end of the stroke. What you do notice in these situations, though, is that the Fox 34 with a 150mm travel is at the end of its sort of capabilities in terms of chassis stiffness. In previous years, we've criticised the Performance Elite Fox suspension for being maybe not quite as supple, maybe a little bit harsher than, say, the RockShox or the Kashima-coated factory stuff. I think this year they've got the balance a little bit better. It certainly doesn't feel quite as bad as it used to. Okay, the Maxxis Recon isn't the grippiest of tyre, but at least on dry, rocky terrain, the rear wheel does sort of seem to remain in contact with the ground pretty nicely when you're hauling on the brakes. So it does give you sort of that confidence to brake a little bit harder than maybe you get away with on some other bikes. One of the things that personally I didn't quite get on with the Spectral for this year is that the stack height at 634mm for a size large is pretty tall, and that's thanks to having quite a long head tube. Having a slightly higher front end helps keep your weight fractionally further back on steep terrain, but I feel that in flatter corners it doesn't aid weighting the front wheel, which can compromise grip and confidence a touch. My issue with a high front end on a bike is that you can't really drop it. Whereas if you have a bike which you feel has a front end that's too low, you can always raise it up a bit. I'd rather see a shorter head tube on the Spectral for this reason. When we first saw the Canyon Spectral, I criticised it for not being particularly progressive with its geometry, and I stand by that. I think trail bikes could be a touch longer than, say, 460mm reach, which this bike has in a large. That said, looking across the whole trail bike of the year this year, that seems to be where trail bikes are pretty planted. Those longer bikes that people are looking for seem to be in the more aggressive enduro end of the market. For trail bikes, you end up with a perfectly balanced, nicely shaped bike, and that's what Canyon's delivered. Along with suspension, that is an improvement on last year's bike. Canyon were knocking on the top three with the CF 9.0. However, maybe the CF 8.0 could have just about squeezed in there at £2,700. That's because it comes with a RockShox pike fork, which is stiffer and offers more confidence in more technical terrain. Okay, there's a few spec differences in there. Slightly cheaper wheels, you get a RockShox shock instead of the Fox on there as well. But overall, I think that could be the killer package within the Spectral range. If you are looking for a trail bike that really should be a do-it-all bike, from big days in the hills to technical trails in your local woods, the Spectral is definitely a really good option if you don't mind that slightly higher front end. Given that it's Canyon, the prices are good, and there will almost definitely be a bike in there to suit your pocket and your needs.